Hello everyone. So recently I finished watching the Harry Potter movies and I thought I'd do like a little review on them because even though I know the books pretty well by now, I have not ever watched the movies prior to this, so I thought I'd just do a review of the movies since I think it will be interesting to see how, and it has been interesting to see how the books and the movies have compared. So I'm just going to present my opinion of every single movie. And spoiler alert, if you are planning to watch the movies in the near future, you probably don't want to hear some of this because I am going to, review some details about the movies. So starting off with The Sorcerer's Stone. And as you know, this is the first book in the Harry Potter book series. And for a film, they do a pretty good job fitting all of the detail inside the book Sorcerer's Stone into the movie. Because obviously there's a lot more content in the books than what can be cramped into like a 2-hour, 30-minute movie, right? So there's a lot more content that has to be fit in. And Sorcerer's Stone is a pretty short book, so it's not that particular hard to fit all the content, but they do a good job of fitting all the content. And this movie is a bit old by now, so you might find some of the displays of magic and some of the special effects to be a little old and a little just jerky. So that is something to consider when you're picking a movie to watch, which is that it's pretty old. But other than that, I feel like it does a pretty good introduction to the characters, pretty good introduction to magic, and a pretty good introduction to Hogwarts. So moving on to the next book, The Chamber of Secrets. This book, it's the last book that I think really tries to fit all of the content from the books into the movies because there isn't really much missed. There isn't really much missed content that is in the movies, but that is in the books, but not the movies. So a lot of detail goes into this film. I think it does a pretty good job of adding to the mystery of the Chamber of Secrets throughout the film itself. And at the end of the film, the battle in the Chamber of Secrets is pretty spectacular. The way they created the chamber is also pretty mysterious and a bit creepy in a sense, but that's what the chamber is supposed to be. So all in all, a pretty decent film. Next, The Prisoner of Azkaban. And even though The Prisoner of Azkaban, the book, is not necessarily reviewed as the best Harry Potter book, this movie, at least in my opinion, it's pretty well done. And this is because I think it cuts out some of the scenes that aren't necessary and it leaves in all of the important scenes. So it does a pretty good job at that, for one thing. And for another, the time management of the film is pretty well done. The front half of the movie, it's not really rushed, but you do also see most of the content from the book fit in. And at the end, with the rescue of Buckbeak and the rescue of Sirius Black, it's not really, there is enough time left for that scene, and it's pretty full of action and pretty intense. So the final fights against the Dementors, pretty well done. So all in all, Prisoner of Azkaban, pretty good movie. Now, with the Goblet of Fire is where things start to go down a little. I feel like it's because there's just so much content from the books, like with the Triwizard Tournament. For example, with the Quidditch, International Quidditch World Cup, that happens at the beginning of the movies, like in the books, that takes up like a good few chapters. But in the movies, we basically jump right into the Quidditch World Cup without much explanation. And they don't actually include the World Cup itself, so the game inside the movies, since it's just, I guess the movie is just so long, we don't really have space for it. But given that, I feel like they should have maybe divided this one book into two films, like a Goblet of Fire Part 1, Goblet of Fire Part 2. Maybe cutting it off at the second task of the Triwizard Tournament, because the problem is there's just so much detail in the actual books that is skipped in the movies. For example, the death of Barty Crouch, it's just mentioned in like one line of dialogue, and there's not much explanation as to how Barty Crouch actually died. So Goblet of Fire, not such a good movie. but the tasks, the action during the tasks, and the action during Voldemort's return, it's pretty well done. But not amazing, but not too bad either. And now, the Order of the Phoenix. The Order of the Phoenix is a personal favorite. In particular, I think the conflict between Hogwarts and Dolores Umbridge is really well done. By the end of the movie, you really hate Dolores Umbridge, which is a sign that her actor did a pretty good job portraying the character. And the final battle in the Department of Mysteries, it's pretty good. It's almost an action movie, so it's pretty intense. The only slight problem I have with the movie is the final duel between Dumbledore and Voldemort. So in the books, Dumbledore just basically didn't try and still easily beat Voldemort. And he uses a lot of cool magic, like for example, turning the statue, making the statue alive and making them attack Voldemort. So Dumbledore does a lot of really cool magic. And whereas in this movie, Dumbledore is shown as mostly defending, which he is, but still he does much less cool magic as he does in the books, which means that the duel between Dumbledore and Voldemort is just less cool in general. But that's okay because the rest of the movie is still really good. And now to the Half-Blood Prince. I feel like this movie is also really good, except there are some little parts where it's a little boring. I can't think of any specific ones, but sometimes the movie is just a little slow. But in general, I feel like this is also pretty good. Great introduction to Professor Slughorn. Professor Slughorn's actor also really nailed the role of Professor Slughorn really well. And in general, a lot of the important details, like for example, Harry trying to get the memory from Slughorn, it's all included. And nothing important is really left out, which is good. And in the end, when Harry and Dumbledore try to get the Horcrux, they are also, the scene, the cave in which they are in is really well done. The cave is a really dark cave. It's just how you imagine it as you're reading the book. So if you watch The Half-Blood Prince, you definitely will not be disappointed. And now the Deathly Hallows. The Deathly Hallows, since the book has a lot of important content, I know that the Deathly Hallows isn't the longest book, but a lot of information conveyed in Deathly Hallows isn't really in a format that is easy to port onto a movie. Like for example, there's a lot of focus on the lies of Albus Dumbledore, on the Deathly Hallows, on the childhood of Dumbledore, on how he slightly mistreated his sister. But in the movies, there's much less emphasis on that. Well, whatever the case, the producers decided to cut the Deathly Hallows into 2 movies, which is a decision that I completely agree with because there was a lot of important content in the Deathly Hallows, and it's probably the most content-filled book of all. And it just really needed to be separated into 2 movies just to get right, because Deathly Hallows is a really important book, last book, right? So the Deathly Hallows Part 1 is basically from the beginning of the book all the way up until when Voldemort gets the Elder Wand, which, as you know, is pretty far into the book. But in the Battle of Hogwarts, just a lot of time is spent on the Battle of Hogwarts. And probably slightly more time is spent in the Gringotts heist, where Harry and Hermione and Ron break into Gringotts and locate Hufflepuff's cups. So that scene is also longer, and the Battle of Hogwarts is also longer. But first, let's talk about Deathly Hallows 1. So some people say that this movie is a little slow because Deathly Hallows 1 is just Harry, Ron, and Hermione sort of drifting around. At one point Ron leaves, but they just mostly aimlessly just run around without finding much. But I actually think it's a really good movie because this is the first time that the characters are out of the school and in the world. And I think the producers just wrote that very well. It was really interesting to look at. There were a lot of fresh scenery. It wasn't always inside Hogwarts all the time. So it was really, really interesting to see. And I especially liked, the scene where Harry, Ron, and Hermione infiltrate the Ministry of Magic and try to get the Horcrux from Umbridge. It's a really intense scene, and you kind of feel the tension as you watch the scene. So all in all, Deathly Hallows Part 1, definitely really well made. It skirted over some parts, as I said, like Dumbledore's sister, and the whole surprise about Dumbledore being infatuated with the Deathly Hallows. But I think it's not at a great cost. I wouldn't mind if that part was cut from the story. The only thing that it really does is provide a deeper understanding of Dumbledore as a character, and without that, the movie is still perfectly fine. Now, Deathly Hallows Part 2, probably one of the best Harry Potter movies. It is, a lot of the time, it's really intense, in a good way. The Battle of Hogwarts, it's much more detailed than it was in the book. There are a lot more fight scenes, a lot more action. And in the final battle between Harry and Voldemort, it wasn't just, Harry revealing himself and then very bravely just kills Voldemort. In the actual book, it was, although Harry was brave, it very much, seemed like chance. But in the movies, there actually was a lengthened battle. There actually was a much longer battle between Harry and Voldemort. And in general, the Battle of Hogwarts was just much more interesting to look at. There was much more action and better overall. So overall, my outlook on these movies is that they're all pretty well done. There are only like one or two things that I would maybe be hesitant about. The one thing is the portrayal of Dumbledore. So in the stories, if you remember, Dumbledore is always like a wise, very wise man and a very patient man, and just generally very much energetic, even though he's old, and he often gives philosophical advice to those around him. Well, in the Harry Potter movies, there were two actors that played Dumbledore. One was Richard Harris, who is now passed away, and the other is Michael Gambon. So these two actors had very different ways of portraying Dumbledore. Richard Harris's Dumbledore was much more benign, and you can clearly tell he's a very old man, but a very kind man, and he's just very quiet and doesn't talk unless he needs to. And Michael Gambon's Dumbledore, I'm a little concerned about, because he's often, he seems like he's always in a hurry, and he's just looks really angry for some reason. And with Harry, he's just much more cold and less warm. Almost in the books, he was almost like a grandfather to Harry. This is especially shown in the Half-Blood Prince, the beginning of the Half-Blood Prince, where he just basically doesn't really look at Harry and just orders him to follow along. Well, in the books, Dumbledore was just much more fatherly and much more warm in general. Again, I'm just being nitpicky here. Both actors did a phenomenal job, as did all of the actors. I feel like all of the actors are basically what I imagined the book characters to be, which is a really big upside. So in general, these movies are very much worth watching if you have a month to slowly watch them over. So yeah, that's just my comment of the movies. I hope you found this interesting. Goodbye.